The courtroom hummed with the low murmur of early morning cases, the sound of shuffling papers and quiet coughs echoing beneath the soft yellow lights. The clock above the bench struck 9 sharp as Judge Caprio took his seat, his presence alone enough to settle the restless energy in the room. He adjusted his glasses, scanning the docket before him. "Next case, Dirks," he said, voice steady, patient, a tone shaped by decades of justice and mercy. The bailiff nodded, calling out the name that instantly drew whispers from the audience. A moment passed. Then the doors swung open. In walked a young man, no more than 25, dressed like he'd stepped out of a luxury ad. Crisp designer jacket, gold watch glinting beneath the sleeves, and sunglasses still perched on his face despite the dim light. He moved with an easy arrogance, every step echoing louder than it should have. Late, unapologetically late. A few spectators exchanged glances, recognizing him. The son of a local millionaire, a name that carried weight outside but meant little in this courtroom. Judge Caprio's eyes lifted slowly from his file. He didn't speak right away. He just watched, measured, unreadable. The young man smirked, tilting his head, clearly amused by the formality of it all. "Sorry, Your Honor," he said casually, sliding his sunglasses onto the desk before sitting down. "Traffic." The courtroom let out a faint collective exhale. Caprio raised one eyebrow. "Traffic?" he repeated, not mocking, not angry, just testing the word. The young man shrugged as though the excuse was good enough for everyone. The judge turned to the bailiff. "We'll mark his appearance," he said calmly. Then to the young man, "You seem unbothered." "Just a ticket, right?" the young man replied, leaning back in his chair, a grin tugging at his mouth. "I've had worse breakfast than this, fine." A few people chuckled nervously. Caprio didn't. His gaze stayed fixed, silent but sharp. The young man met it, expecting a reaction, but none came. The judge's stillness was its own kind of power. The laughter lingered awkwardly, fading when Caprio finally spoke again. "In this courtroom," he said softly, "we treat everyone equally, whether they have $1 or 1,000,000. The young man blinked, unsure how to respond. Caprio's tone carried no anger, only gravity. The courtroom seemed to hold its breath. For a moment, the echo of the judge's words filled the air like a warning the young man didn't yet understand. He gave a short laugh, almost defensive. "Of course, Judge. I get it." But his eyes said otherwise. Caprio leaned back in his chair, his calm stare never wavering. "We'll see," he murmured. The gavel rested quietly by his hand, its weight symbolic and patient, waiting for the moment when laughter would no longer be his shield, but his lesson. The laughter echoed just a little too long. It wasn't unloud, but it carried that kind of laugh that doesn't come from amusement, but arrogance. The young man leaned back in his chair, one arm over the backrest, the other tapping his fine leather shoes against the floor. In his hand, the citation, a parking ticket, folded and creased as if it were nothing more than a joke. $300, he said, grinning toward the audience. "That's pocket change." A few uneasy smiles flickered among the spectators, but most looked away. The air began to feel heavy, like the room itself disapproved. Judge Caprio watched him quietly. He didn't interrupt. He'd seen this kind of bravado before, confidence mistaken for invincibility. He adjusted his glasses, scanning the paperwork again, giving the young man space to show who he really was. "So," Caprio finally said, his tone light but measured, "you're here for a parking violation on Westminster Street. Do you recall the incident?" The young man chuckled, still unbothered. "Of course. I parked for a few minutes outside a cafe. They called it a restricted zone." He made air quotes, as if the term itself was ridiculous. "Guess they don't know who I am." The words hung there like smoke. Caprio's pen stopped mid-stroke. He looked up slowly, the faintest crease forming between his brows. "And who are you?" he asked gently. The young man smirked. "Let's just say my family pays more in taxes than most people make in a year. I think a parking ticket isn't going to break me." He leaned forward as though expecting the courtroom to laugh with him. But no one did. The laughter he'd invited died before it began. Even the clerk paused her typing. Caprio's voice came next, calm, almost too calm. "Do you find something funny about this courtroom, sir?" The young man shrugged. "Not funny, Your Honor, just a bit unnecessary for a ticket." He waved the citation lazily. "It's just paper." The judge's gaze was steady. His silence grew louder than any words could. The young man's smile faltered, just slightly, under that weight. Caprio leaned forward, resting his forearms on the bench. "You say it's just a ticket," he said softly, his tone shifting from calm to deliberate. "But what you're really saying is that the law only matters when it inconveniences you?" A hush settled over the room. Even the clock's ticking seemed to stop. The young man swallowed, his grin stiffening into a nervous half-smile. He tried to look away but couldn't. There was something disarming about the judge's calmness. Not anger, not humiliation, but something deeper. It was reflection. Judge Caprio's fingers tapped once on the gavel, not striking, just thinking. "You know," he said after a pause, "I've seen men with nothing show more respect for this courtroom than those who walk in with everything." His words weren't sharp, but they cut. The young man blinked, trying to decide whether to respond or retreat. He chose silence. The judge waited, studying him for a long moment. Then he leaned back, eyes unwavering. "Let's continue," he said. His voice was calm again, too calm, and somewhere beneath that quiet tone, the young man could feel it. The shift. Something deeper was coming. Judge Caprio leaned back slightly in his chair, fingers folded under his chin as he studied the young man before him. The boy still carried that faint smirk, the kind that belonged to someone who'd never been told no for very long. Caprio's eyes softened, not with pity, but with memory. "Your last name," he began slowly, "it sounds familiar?" The young man raised an eyebrow. "I'm sure it does," he said, leaning back, the smugness creeping into his tone again. "My father's kind of a big deal around here." Caprio nodded thoughtfully, eyes lowering to the papers in front of him. "Yes, I remember him," he said. "Your father, Richard Donovan. A good man." The courtroom fell quieter. The young man's smirk wavered slightly, uncertain now if this was praise or prelude. The judge continued, voice calm, steady, carrying the weight of decades. "I remember when a family down on Elm Street lost their home in a fire. Your father was the first to show up. No cameras, no announcements, just a man with a checkbook and a kind heart." He paused. "I was there that day." The young man shifted in his chair. "That was a long time ago," he muttered. Caprio didn't look up yet. "Then there was the winter storm, '08. He paid for groceries for families who couldn't afford them. You know what he told me when I thanked him?" The judge finally raised his gaze, his eyes sharp but not unkind. "If I have more than I need," he said, "then someone else must need it more." His words hung in the air like a quiet sermon. The young man sighed, his bravado cracking just slightly. "Yeah, well, that's his thing," he said dismissively. "He likes helping people. I'm not him." The judge's brow furrowed faintly. "No," he said softly. "You're not." The courtroom stilled completely now. The audience leaned in, sensing the shift. Caprio's tone carried no anger, but every syllable felt deliberate. "Your father built respect not with money, but with grace. He earned it one small act of kindness at a time, and today his son sits before me, laughing at the law, mocking the people who serve it." The young man's throat tightened, the air suddenly heavier than before. His hand went to adjust his cufflink, more out of nervousness than pride. Caprio leaned forward now, his voice lowering, steady as stone. "I've seen men with less than your family has give more to strangers than you's given decency today. Do you understand what that means?" The young man hesitated. His lips parted, but no words came out. For the first time, he looked less like a man and more like a boy who had never been held accountable under the shadow of someone greater. Judge Caprio's gaze softened once more, the disappointment deep but controlled. Your father's name, he said finally, his tone like a quiet verdict, carries weight in this city. But it isn't your inheritance that matters, son. It's his heart, and that I don't see in you yet. The young man swallowed, his eyes dropping to the table. The laughter that had once filled the courtroom was gone, replaced by a silence that echoed louder than words. The air in the courtroom felt tighter now, a stillness that came only before truth was about to be revealed. Judge Caprio's eyes lingered on the young man, who sat stiffly at the defendant's table, arms crossed, jaw set. The arrogance that had once filled his posture was cracking, replaced by the faint shadow of unease. Caprio tapped his pen once against the desk, then looked to the bailiff. "Play the footage," he said softly. The lights dimmed slightly as the monitor flickered to life. A grainy video from a traffic camera began rolling. The timestamp showed 7:42 a.m. A weekday morning. The familiar stretch of road appeared, painted crosswalk, blinking school zone lights, and a line of children waiting to cross. A moment later, a black sports car, unmistakable, glossy, expensive, shot across the screen at dangerous speed. A gust of wind from its movement sent papers flying from a crossing guard's hands. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. The young man's face stiffened. He leaned forward, eyes narrowing as if denial might change the image. Caprio's voice broke through the heavy silence. "That car belongs to you, doesn't it?" he asked. The young man hesitated. "Yes, Your Honor," he finally muttered. "Those flashing lights," Caprio continued, his tone level. "Mean children are crossing. And that sign, right there, says 15 miles per hour. Do you know how fast you were going?" The defendant's voice was faint. "Maybe 40. 45. The judge nodded slowly. 57, he corrected gently, reading from the report. In a school zone. The room was silent again. Caprio leaned forward slightly, eyes never leaving the young man. "What if one of those children had stepped forward a second earlier?" he asked quietly. "What if that crossing guard hadn't been paying attention?" His voice wasn't loud, but it carried like thunder in the silence. The young man's lips parted, but no words came. His fingers fidgeted on the table edge. He looked smaller now, as if the footage had stripped him of the protection his last name once offered. Caprio's tone softened, but it didn't waver. "I've seen a lot of things in this courtroom," he said. "Anger, mistakes, even tragedy. But this could have been one." He gestured slightly toward the screen, now frozen on a frame where a child, no older than 8, stood a few feet from the passing car. That little boy had his backpack on. He was ready for school. Not for you to turn that corner like it was a racetrack. The young man swallowed hard, his eyes glued to the image. The sound of the courtroom clock ticking felt deafening now. Caprio took a deep breath, lowering his gaze to the papers before him, then back up again. "Do you understand what responsibility means?" he asked. "It's not just following the law. It's understanding that your choices, even the ones you think are small, gladiator, carry weight. They ripple outward." He paused. "You weren't just speeding," he said, his tone now a quiet blade, deliberate and unflinching. "You were gambling with someone else's child." The words hit the room like a verdict. The young man's breath caught. His eyes glistened, the bravado completely gone. A mother in the back row covered her mouth. The bailiff looked away. Even the hum of the overhead lights seemed to fade. Caprio leaned back slightly, allowing the silence to settle. He adjusted his glasses, his voice returning to its calm rhythm. "The thing about arrogance," he said gently, "is that it blinds us to the damage we can cause, until we finally see it play back in front of us." The young man's hands trembled slightly as he reached for the water on the table, but he didn't drink. He only nodded faintly, shame replacing the smirk that had once seemed permanent. The judge's expression softened, not with satisfaction, but with the heavy compassion of a man who had seen too many lessons learned too late. And, as the monitor dimmed back to black, the courtroom exhaled as one. the weight of the moment lingering like the echo of a warning none would forget. Judge Caprio sat quietly for a long moment, hands folded before him. The courtroom was still charged from the footage they had just seen, the air heavy with what could have been. The young man sat motionless, eyes fixed on the desk, his earlier bravado replaced by something unspoken. Maybe shame, maybe realization. The judge took a slow breath, then looked to the bailiff. "Bring them in," he said softly. The door opened and a woman entered, holding the hand of a small boy no older than 9. She looked nervous but determined. The sound of her heels on the floor echoed through the silent courtroom. Caprio rose slightly from his seat, a gesture of respect. "Ma'am," he said kindly, "thank you for coming." She nodded and sat down beside the witness stand, her son climbing onto the seat beside her. He clutched a worn blue backpack in his lap. "This is Mrs. Alvarez," Caprio announced to the court, "and her son, Leo. 2 years ago, they were nearly hit by a speeding car outside St. Mary's School, same street, same kind of zone." The young man's head lifted slowly, eyes darting toward them. Mrs. Alvarez's hands trembled as she adjusted the microphone. "It happened so fast," she began, voice shaky. "We were crossing the street. I saw the light flashing. I thought we were safe. Then this car came out of nowhere." Her throat tightened and she blinked rapidly. "It missed us by inches. Leo fell. I thought—" She stopped, pressing her lips together. The boy looked down, his small fingers tracing the zipper of his bag. Caprio nodded gently, his eyes filled with compassion. "Take your time," he said. She breathed in slowly. "Since that day," she continued, "he flinches every time he hears tires screech. Even walking to school now, I hold his hand the whole way." The courtroom was silent, everyone frozen in the weight of her words. The young man's gaze fell again. His hands, once folded confidently, were now clenched together. His shoulders sank. He looked at the boy, whose innocence made the footage they'd just seen feel 100 times heavier. Judge Caprio's voice broke the silence, low, reflective. "When we drive," he said, "we forget how powerful our machines are. We forget that behind every crosswalk light, there's a story waiting to change forever." His tone was gentle but unwavering. "Mrs. Alvarez, thank you for reminding us what those flashing lights truly mean." She nodded, wiping her eyes as the bailiff guided her and her son out. When the door closed, Caprio turned back to the young man. The judge didn't speak immediately. Instead, he let the silence speak first. That long, humbling pause that seemed to stretch across every inch of the courtroom. Finally, he said, "Still think it's funny?" The young man shook his head, his voice barely a whisper. "No, Your Honor." Caprio leaned forward slightly, his tone now softer. "Good," he said, "because sometimes, son, the lesson isn't written on the ticket. It's written in the faces of the people who almost didn't make it home." The young man blinked rapidly, emotion breaking through the last of his defenses. He pressed his lips together, nodding faintly. The judge watched him, not with judgment, but with the patient silence of someone who had seen many come to that same breaking point, the moment when arrogance gives way to understanding. The gavel remained untouched. There would be time for judgment later. For now, the room stayed still, letting the lesson sink in. The silence that followed was almost sacred. The courtroom, moments ago filled with the trembling voice of a mother, now sat still, every eye fixed on the young man. He hadn't moved since they'd left, only stared at the floor as if trying to find the words buried somewhere in his own reflection. Judge Caprio leaned forward slightly, his expression patient, not pressing, only waiting. Then slowly, the young man stood. His hands trembled as he adjusted his jacket, though the gesture felt more like a shield than a style. He began, his voice cracking from the weight that had been building since the footage played. "I didn't realize." The words came out almost in a whisper. He swallowed, then looked toward the door where the mother and her son had exited moments earlier. "I didn't realize what I could have done. I was stupid. His shoulders sagged, the arrogance gone. The same young man who once smirked behind sunglasses now looked 10 years younger, stripped of ego, left with truth. I thought because I had money, or because people knew my name, it didn't matter, but it does. It really does. No one spoke. Even the bailiff, usually stoic, kept his eyes lowered out of respect. The young man took a deep breath, steadying himself, then turned toward Judge Caprio. Your Honor, he said softly, you were right. I don't have my father's heart. He always told me that what you give others is who you are, and I forgot that. He hesitated, then looked down again, his voice breaking slightly. I think he'd be ashamed if he saw me here today. Caprio watched him closely, his gaze steady but warm, his fingers resting gently on the bench. The young man continued, his voice stronger now. I saw that boy's face. I saw how scared he was, and for the first time I thought, that could have been me when I was little. Someone's son. Someone who just wanted to cross the street. He paused, blinking back tears. I'm sorry. To them. To you. To my dad. The apology hung in the air, not rehearsed, not forced. It was raw, shaped by humility that had taken an entire morning to find. Caprio didn't respond right away. He let the silence sit again, the kind that carries reflection, not judgment. Finally, he nodded slowly. Apologies mean something when they come from the soul, he said, his tone gentle. And I think yours just did. The young man nodded, exhaling shakily as if releasing the last of his pride. Caprio's eyes softened. You know, he said, our parents can teach us right from wrong, but the world... He gestured faintly around the room. The world is what reminds us why those lessons matter. For the first time, the young man smiled, faintly, almost painfully. He nodded, wiping at his eyes. Caprio leaned forward, his voice kind but firm. It's never too late, he said, a small smile tugging at his lips. To remember who raised you. The young man looked up, meeting his eyes. For the first time that morning, there was gratitude. Not from privilege, but from perspective. Judge Caprio took a long pause before speaking. The kind of silence that holds more weight than words ever could. The young man stood still, eyes lowered, waiting. Not with arrogance this time, but with acceptance. The courtroom seemed to breathe as one. Caprio adjusted his glasses, glanced down at the ticket on his desk, and then back up at the young man before him. I have thought about this, he began softly, his tone neither harsh nor forgiving, just steady, grounded in truth. The fine will remain. You broke the law, and the law must stand. The young man nodded quietly, the words landing not as punishment, but as understanding. But Caprio wasn't finished. He leaned forward slightly, resting his hands on the bench. However, he continued, I believe punishment without purpose teaches nothing. He paused, letting the idea settle. So here's what we'll do. In addition to the fine, you'll spend 50 hours volunteering at the Elmwood Youth Center. You'll work with kids, teach them about responsibility, safety, and what happens when we forget the value of a single second. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Surprise, admiration, maybe even relief. The young man looked up, meeting the judge's eyes for the first time with something real. Yes, Your Honor, he said quietly, voice steady. I'll do it. Caprio nodded. Good, he replied, almost like a teacher satisfied that a lesson had finally reached home. Because sometimes, he said, his voice softening, the best way to make amends is to help others avoid the same mistake. The young man swallowed hard, the truth of those words sinking deep. A small, genuine smile formed at the corner of Caprio's mouth. You've been given a second chance, don't waste it. He tapped his pen once against the desk, then looked out toward the courtroom. Case dismissed. The gavel struck gently, not as a hammer of judgment, but as a note of closure. For a moment, there was silence. Then a soft, respectful applause began from the back rows. It wasn't celebration. It was recognition of growth, of humility, of change. As the young man gathered his papers and turned to leave, He hesitated. At the door, he looked back toward the bench. The arrogance that had once filled his gaze was gone, replaced by something quieter. Gratitude. Judge Caprio met his eyes and nodded once, the faintest smile in return. Justice had been served, but more importantly, so had humanity. The courtroom had emptied, leaving behind the quiet hum of the overhead lights and the faint echo of footsteps fading into the hallway. Papers rustled softly as Judge Caprio closed the final file of the morning, his fingers resting for a moment on its cover. He exhaled slowly, the weight of the day still lingering in his chest, not from anger, but from reflection. Across the room, the empty defendant's table still seemed to carry the energy of the young man who had stood there, once defiant, then humbled. Caprio's gaze lingered on it before he leaned back in his chair, speaking more to the room, and to those who might one day sit there, than to anyone present. Money, he began, his voice low but resonant, can buy privilege, but not respect. He paused, the words settling like dust in the still air. It can open doors, he continued, but not hearts. His tone carried neither condemnation nor pride, only truth, born from years of watching people of every kind stand before him, all stripped down to the same measure of accountability. He adjusted his glasses and looked out over the rows of empty seats. In this courtroom, it doesn't matter who you are or what you own. Every story starts the same, a mistake, a moment, a choice. What matters is what you learn from it. He smiled faintly, not at any one person, but at the unseen tapestry of lives that had crossed paths in this space, each leaving a small mark, a lesson, a reminder of humanity. He picked up his gavel, turning it in his hand thoughtfully, the polished wood reflecting a soft glint of light. Humility, he said after a long pause, isn't weakness, it's strength in disguise. It's knowing that no matter how high you rise, you're never too high to do the right thing. His voice softened, more like a grandfather speaking to a child than a judge to a courtroom. True wealth, he added, isn't counted in dollars. It's counted in kindness, in awareness, in how you treat the people who can't give you anything in return. The camera would slowly pan across the empty benches as he spoke, the dust motes catching in the sunlight that filtered through the blinds, a quiet beauty in the stillness of justice after its storm. Caprio glanced once more toward the bench where the young man had stood. The memory of that smirk, now replaced by gratitude, flickered in his mind. Laughter fades, he said gently, almost to himself, but lessons, they last. He placed the gavel back on the bench, his hand lingering for just a heartbeat before lifting it again. The sound that followed was simple, final, and profound. Not just an end, but a beginning for someone who had finally understood.